What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I don't care if anybody watches this video, I wanted to cover this. So I've recently been reading Sweet Tooth, which actually came out of Vertigo, and it's a Netflix series that's coming up. This story is amazing, right? It's probably one of the coolest stories that I've read, and is written by Jeff Lemire, who actually drew it as well, which is kind of awesome. I didn't know Jeff Lemire had pretty good drawing chops. This is pretty cool. But the cool thing behind this is that this story is, in a lot of ways, a post-apocalyptic story, right? So the way this opens up is with the kind of main character. We find out his name here in a second, but you get this main character where he basically has this kind of vision, or this dream that he's been experiencing really multiple times, where he finds this man, right? This kind of strange man. He calls him like a big man who's basically just looking at him with just these cold looking eyes. And then he runs away as fast as he possibly can. But no matter how far he runs, this guy keeps getting closer and closer. And then ultimately the character wakes up, right? And so from there, he actually ends up overhearing his father. Now, his father is a really interesting character here. And the reason why is because the two of them basically share a cabin, or share a kind of homestead of sorts. And he actually prays to God every night. Now, there are a few things that are given to us here. One of the things established right off the bat is that this kid basically lost his mother, and his father is the only person that's really there to take care of him. But his father's prayers for his son are not really done just by an arbitrary thing, right? He really believes them with full conviction, and he's always praying that God keeps them protected from the forces that are out there, right? That God keeps them safe. And it's kind of a funny thing, because what you end up learning with this kid is that he actually has antlers. But the other thing about this is his dad has kind of told him stories about years gone by, right? About how society used to be before this great collapse. Now, the reality is this place in which they live is the Nebraska State Wilderness Sanctuary. So the fact they're able to kind of occupy this place with nobody really knowing they're there is kind of a big testament to how far things have gone. That and the fact that you've got phone lines or power lines that are just kind of collapsed shows the society itself has more or less fallen to the wayside, right? Whatever this is, it is by all standards of measurement a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The funny thing about this is that as he's there, he actually ends up seeing this kind of candy bar that's sitting out in the street, and where he initially goes to grab it, he kind of remembers a lesson from his father, which was don't grab that stuff, right? Don't eat those candy bars, those foods and things like that that are out there. Now, with dinner with his father, this is where things get kind of interesting. He starts coughing up blood. So right off the bat, we know that his father's not long for this world. Now, this is an important thing, because those of you guys who are familiar with things like the hero's journey, stuff like that, you know that you kind of have like the main hero who starts out in what is more or less their safe space. And they have kind of a mentor to a degree, but not officially, right? Their actual mentor will come later on down the line. Instead, some kind of situation arises that forces them to leave their home. In this instance, this kid, his safe space is the house he lives in under the protection of his father. The problem is that in the middle of all this, he kind of overhears this sort of cracking sound, and he sees another candy bar that's sitting out there. He ultimately unwraps it and then starts to eat it. Now, when he gets back home and his father realizes he's got a candy bar in his hand and he's eating it, his father immediately freaks out. And that's when you get the character's name, which is Gus. And what happens here is Gus just kind of reveals, well, I found it out there and I ate it and brought it back. And his dad's like, where did you get this from? But the fact that he has this candy bar is of huge concern for his father. And the reason why is because no one's supposed to know they're there, right? No one's supposed to be aware of the fact that they're there. More so than that, there seems to be this kind of thing where it's used as a trick to basically lure people like Gus out, right? It's designed to either force him to let his guard down or to keep him distracted by what it is that he's eating. Regardless of the situation, people know they're there now. And that's when his father says, like, you have to be more careful, right? He talks about a kind of illness, and he says, this illness is in me, and I know I'm going soon. When the question is asked, like, how long do you have? It's, we don't know. And that's when you get what little information in this opening story that you get about the mom, which is she seemed to fall pretty fast, right? She went pretty quickly. That for people who contract whatever this illness is, there's no definitive time frame on how long that they will live. For some people, they last weeks. Others, they last months. Presumably, if you take an average, people end up lasting days. It really depends on seemingly a myriad of factors, which we'll find out later on. But for the most part, we don't have a lot of information here. But the whole purpose behind Gus's father really instilling in him this philosophy of you can't let people know that you're here, you can't let them know that you're around, is really rooted in the purpose of just keeping Gus as safe as possible, to keep him away from this world. But as we know, when it comes to us as young people, especially with teenagers, you push boundaries, right? When your parents say, don't do something, you do it. If for no other reason than the fact that you want to know why you're not supposed to do it, right? That curiosity gets the better of you. But regardless of the circumstance, you end up having a kind of period of time that passes where his father just kind of stopped talking to God, right? It just kind of kept to himself, and the illness basically took him. Now, we're not really given a definitive time frame here. We simply just know some period of time happened, and then his father basically passed away, after which he buried him, and then it was just Gus alone in the woods. Now, at that point, he's actually visited by a deer, which is kind of wild. But this is important because this deer gets shot, and then in turn, you have a couple hunters who come out of nowhere. And this is when we start to get this kind of greater explanation of what's going on, that it's not as though they were just sort of traveling and came across a deer, and they have no knowledge of Gus, nothing about a person walking around with antlers. It's one of the guys who thought it was a hybrid. And so essentially they have knowledge of not only Gus, but people like Gus. This is kind of exacerbated or expanded on when he says like, no, like it was a kid. It was a kid with antlers, right? It was a hybrid. I saw him out here. I know he was here. The other thing that kind of goes on is that while they end up basically tracking down Gus, and Gus runs away as fast as he can, and then is ultimately cornered by these guys who really kind of talk about how it's one of these things where they can sell him, they can make a lot of money off of him. There seems to be a kind of market for kids like that. Now, why that's the case, we'll find out later on down the line. Instead, what you end up getting is one of these guys who's shot in the head. And ultimately, Gus is saved by a guy named Jepperd, which is kind of an interesting and bit of a unique name. It's one of these funny things where Jepperd really kind of gets the trust of Gus by virtue of the fact that he saved his life. And Jepperd here is really presented to us as kind of a grizzled and pretty experienced guy, right? He's kind of hardcore, but it's one of these things where he really seemed to be looking out for Gus. When he kind of says like, I've never seen one that was like part deer before. And one of the funny things that happens is he kind of asks him, he's like, how long have you been here, right? How long have you experienced all this? And when he's like, where's your mom? Where's your dad? The reality is he says like, my mom's dead. She went to heaven, and my dad only died not too long ago. And so we kind of asked him, he's like, how long have you been in this place? And this kid says like, I've been here my whole life. And when he asks, how old are you? He says, my dad told me that last year I was 9. And that's when Jepperd kind of hits in and says, that's not possible. People like you didn't start popping up until after this illness started spreading across presumably the world. And this didn't start until 7 years ago. So you're telling me that you predate this illness. There's a lot of intrigue and mystery going on here. Of course, as you guys can tell, we're far from getting the full picture. But he asks him, did your dad ever tell you about a place called the Preserve? And when Gus says no, his response is, it's a safe place, right? For people like you that are half human, half animal. But basically, people are out there hunting for you. People are trying to find you. They're trying to kill you, or at the very least trying to sell you so they can make money off of you. Like the Preserve is a safe place for people like you that keeps you kind of hidden away. Now, the cool thing about Jepperd, and that's what's so interesting here, is on one side, you could say he's sus, right? Like in like a conservative estimate, this guy is sus as hell, right? But on the other hand, he really presents himself as a guy who saved the life of Gus. And in doing that, he basically earns Gus's trust to a degree. When he initially tells Gus, you need to come with me, Gus's immediate response is, no, right? Like, I'm not going with you. I don't know you. Like, why would I go with you? And so he's like, fine. He throws him a slingshot back and says, good luck, kid, right? Like, I don't really care whether you come with me or not. And so that right there is kind of our first indication that it's not as though Jepperd is out for Gus, right? It's not as though he's basically a hunter who killed off competition. Instead, he's just kind of like it seems more or less like a wanderer, right? Or some kind of a vagrant, just kind of roaming around and doing his thing. But then Gus seeks him out. And the reality is Gus is not really in a position to where he's capable of taking care of himself, right? He, in a lot of ways, needs a kind of mentor here. He needs somebody to kind of keep an eye on him, somebody to watch over him so Gus can learn the ropes of how to take care of himself. And then when the time presents itself, he can kind of, again, graduate out into this greater tribe and basically make it in the world on his own. And so as a result, where he kind of had the dream of this big man who seemed exceedingly scary, instead of running, he actually goes with him. And so while the two of them kind of take him aside and just sort of relax for the night just because of the fact that it seems like traveling at night is not really the best thing for you to do, instead, Jepperd kind of gives us this little bit of an explanation on what's going on. We don't get a full-on explanation here. Instead, it's really more of a tease or something like that. But when he asks him, did your father ever tell you how all this started? The response of Gus is, well, he said that God came and took most people up to heaven, and the ones that stayed here, well, they have it real hard and they have to pray really hard so they can go to heaven too, right? It's almost kind of given as like a rapture. That's almost the way that Gus's father presented it to him, that the faithful were taken to heaven and those who were left behind have to demonstrate their conviction and their belief and acceptance of God and Jesus in order to actually get into heaven when the second kind of rapture comes around. And the response to this guy is, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? That's not what happened at all. Instead, like everybody got sick, right? Everybody got really, 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 really sick. And ultimately, everybody here in the world is infected, right? So seemingly, whatever this is an environmental thing, right? You can't necessarily escape it. You can't go to an underground bunker and be safe, or possibly you could, but so long as you're on the surface, you're infected, right? Which basically means for all of humanity, the clock's ticking, right? There's only a matter of time before everybody dies. That's exactly what Jepperd said, right? Like everybody's going to die. It's only a matter of time before they do. In the end, they're all just trying to outlive it. The only exception are you guys, you hybrid kids who for whatever reason are immune to this infection. You're not infected by it. You won't die from it. It just exists out there. And for you, it's no different than how it was for us as humans before all this started in the first place. And so there's no real definitive answers that are given by Jepperd, but he does kind of reveal a bit of a harder streak when he says, like, God has nothing to do with anything that's going on here, and I don't want to hear anything more about how God made all this stuff happen, right? Like, and it's one of these things where he kind of presents himself as a guy who is in some ways a realist, but also a bit of of a cynic, right? In the sense that it's just, this is the way in which the world is, right? There's no possibility it could be anything other. The world is hard and it's tough. We're all gonna die, and that's just the way that it is, right? It's kind of ruthless and a little bit rough here. But in the middle of all that, while Jepperd is trying to catch some sleep, you end up having these humans who kind of show up with like animal masks on, right? So right off the bat, we've got tribalism, right? Basically humans breaking down into smaller tribes. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you read any sort of philosophical or even a political book that focuses on what humanity would be like during the collapse of a society, right? If the US government just completely collapsed and there was no standing military anymore, right? Or anything along those lines. Say, for example, you had some scenario like the TV show Jericho where like nuclear bombs were detonated in like 21 major US cities, whatever it is, it's just like the collapse of society. What you would have is basically warlords and petty strongmen that would rule small pockets of society across the US. And those individuals who lacked the conviction or confidence to basically handle themselves adequately would pursue those petty warlords and strongmen, and they would look to them for a measure of protection. Following that, it really kind of falls into like Hobbesian philosophy in a state of nature, or kind of a lack of any organized government, when it's sure, those petty warlords and those strongmen would abuse their power, but those individuals who are being ruled over would accept that as the price they pay for the protection they get. So again, it's kind of an interesting concept. And so what you end up getting is one of these guys who manages to snatch up Gus and then basically take off with him. Of course, Jepperd comes to the rescue and shoots this guy in the head and then essentially succumbs to his wounds, right? Not in the sense that he dies, he really just kind of passes out, but ultimately Gus ends up being the one to save him when they come across a little bit of a barn or a kind of shed. And in the time that he had with his father taught him how to grow crops. His father taught him how to deal with wounds and injuries, essentially all kinds of survival skills he would need in order to make it on his own if he were to ever sustain an injury, or if he were to ever find allies and had to tend to their injuries. And that's exactly what happened here, right? That while Jepperd is kind of passed out and succumbing to his injuries, or at least, coping with his injuries as best he can, that Gus ends up sort of finding a house off in the distance and then just sort of goes through and raids the place and finds like some cans of food and different things along those lines. One of the other things he finds here is there's a little kid upstairs in their bedroom who's basically died. And so what this does is it seems to point to the idea that because the parents are nowhere to be found, the kid was abandoned, right? And that was it, right? This kid was basically just left alone. The other part of this is this kid is essentially reading the story of Bambi. The alternative to that possibility is their parents died before they did, and then they ultimately succumbed to the sickness and then died too. The reason why I say that is because, as you guys know, a hallmark of the story Bambi is that Bambi's mom dies, and Bambi's ultimately taken by his father and then raised, but that doesn't really seem to happen here. Regardless of how you slice it, Gus ends up having this dream once he falls asleep where he's met by the arrival of a couple different animals, and one of them comes in the form of what he imagines this little kid would be like if he was actually Bambi, along with another animal. And it's one of these things where they literally talk to him and say, like, we don't have much time, right? Like, you have to listen very, very carefully. You have to take as much food as you can from that house and run away, and you have to go back to the woods. Don't go back to your house in the woods, but you have to go back to the woods. And that's where Gus is kind of like, no, like, Mr. Jepperd is looking out for me, right? He's keeping me safe. He's doing just like my dad did. And the response of Dandy here is, no, Gus, like, it's not safe, and he's an exceedingly bad man, and there'll be even more bad men soon. So you have to get out as fast as you can. And they literally tell him, run, right? Like, run as fast as you possibly can. But ultimately, that doesn't really happen. Instead, you end up having Gus, who wakes up from his dream, and then in turn, he leans a little further into Jepperd by just kind of being like, okay, like, this guy is keeping me safe. This guy's protecting me, right? Like, why should I be worried about a man who's protecting me from like all these different bad men who are out there? But ultimately, you end up coming into this kind of smaller town of sorts. And when they get there's a huge section of town that's kind of cordoned off where you have like all these dead bodies, right? Like all these folks who have just kind of been piled up and just sort of left there, and that was it. So what this really kind of shows us is like society was collapsing exceedingly fast, right? Like people were dying very, very quickly. So much so that there wasn't a whole lot of time to dispose of the bodies or anything along those lines. But they end up stumbling across what looks like a kind of apartment building of sorts, and Gus notices there's a person up there. And so what they end up doing is getting into this place, and there's a girl who basically says like, my name's Becky, what's your name? And so seemingly she looks like she's a kind of prostitute or something, and then they're kind of taken by surprise by the guy who's more or less running the brothel along with his wife, and then they intend to basically kill and rob Jepperd. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because once they also realize Gus is there, they're like, okay, we can do a lot with this, right? Like we can like sell this kid to a militia camp. We can do pretty much anything. And that's one of the things where they're kind of like, we'll take the kid off your hands, and we have a lot to trade, right? And kind of offers the girls who were there. Not only that, this girl Becky was wearing like fake rabbit ears. She's just a regular human. But the reality of this is that this husband and wife essentially have taken these girls. We don't know if they were kidnapped or whatever the case is, but they've taken these girls and they present them as an offer to somebody if they have something to trade, or at the very least use them as bait and a distraction against people in order to essentially take them away, in order to take away the belongings they have and the things they need to survive. More or less like setting up a trap. The funny thing about that too is that you actually have Gus who's like, no, you have to let us leave. Mr. Jepperd's gonna take me to the sanctuary. And that's where Becky's like, no, that's not real. That's a made up place. Like, what are you talking about? And the wife here is just like, kill him, right? Just kill him and be done with it. That's when this man looks at Jepperd and he's like, oh, you're taking him to the preserve? It looks like I'm not the only businessman here, right? Like, that's apparently what you're doing here. And that's when he says, like, what's stopping me from taking this kid off to, the preserve myself, and kind of calling it a day. So again, all these hints and all these indications are coming in this direction that like the preserve is not a very good place. But Jepperd really kind of hits it off and says, look, like, do you think you can pull that trigger faster than I can literally kill you, right? Or yank that gun out of your hand or something like that. Are you that quick? And so we're kind of dealing with this idea that Jepperd is pretty hardcore. And so ultimately they don't call his bluff. They're like, okay, like they buy into it. They're like, just let him go, right? Let him go. Let's call it a day. And so Jepperd ends up leaving alongside Gus. The problem with this is the girls almost kind of like beg to a degree, like save us, right? Like, please, like, get us out of this place. And Gus really shows this kind of moral compass here when he tells Jepperd, like, no, we can't just leave here. Like, I know you want to, but we can't just leave here. And then upstairs, they hear one of the girls being slapped around by presumably the guy. And so because of this, Jepperd heads back upstairs, literally with his rifle, tells one of the girls to be quiet, and then just takes it to this guy and literally helps him understand his place in the bigger picture, right? Just like smashes this guy's head in, right? Just beats this guy to death with the butt of his rifle. And then where he goes to kill the girl, one of the other girls is like, no, let us be the one to do it, right? And so they just like blow this girl's head off, and the whole time it's being watched by Gus. And so Gus is getting a lot of experiences that he's never seen before. But the other part of this is that when Jepperd goes to leave, one of the girls is like, no, you have to stay, you have to protect us. We can use a guy like you. So again, people who aren't necessarily capable of protecting themselves flocking to what they perceive to be stronger individuals, right? Just the nature of a collapsed society. And even in an organized society, that's still kind of the case, right? I mean, technically they call it hypergamy, but it's essentially the exact same concept, just in a post-apocalyptic landscape. But the important thing is that ultimately Jepperd is like, no, right? We're not staying here, right? Like Jepperd, and that's when Gus is kind of like, no, like he's going to take me to the preserve. Everything's going to be okay. And this girl's like, okay, yeah, sure. Like the preserve, right? You'll see it's not a good place, right? You better watch your back. The preserve, that's no preserve. Like where you're going, that's not what you think it is. And so ultimately you end up having Gus and Jepperd, who basically just race as fast as they possibly can to where the destination is supposed to be, right? To this preserve itself. They end up coming across a couple individuals who are really kind of a trap that's set up by people who are looking to like, rob others and different things like that. The kind of stuff you would normally expect to see in some kind of a post-apocalyptic landscape. And in the process, the horse is shot. Gus goes flying off, bumps his head, and kind of knocks him unconscious. And so with the horse basically being dead, Jepperd picks him up and then walks the rest of the way, and ultimately ends up getting him directly to the preserve. The problem is the place looks shady at best. It looks like a concentration camp. It's not enormous, it's pretty small, but you've got like guards and things like that. It's not really a preserve in the traditional sense, right? People who are basically being kept in captivity behind a fence. And so when that happens, when basically Jepperd shows up and says, hey, like, tell him what's going on, right? Like, get a hold of Abbott, tell him it's Jepperd. Then in turn, once Abbott approaches and starts talking to him, then he's like, okay, like, this is cool. Like you brought us a kid, he said he's 9 years old. Okay, this works, man. This kid will make a great specimen. So obviously the preserve is not what we thought it was. And Jepperd is not a good guy. Jepperd he's a hunter. Like literally he was killing other guys who were hunters. He was killing the competition. And literally the whole thing behind this is he gets some kind of huge amount of payment. And he basically just sells Gus to the preserve. Now the crazy thing about that is in this place, it's a place of nightmare and torment. This is a horrible place to be in. And Gus is learning right off the bat, you can't trust everybody. It doesn't mean that people themselves cannot be trusted, but it's like the movie The Italian Job. People are good. It's the devil inside them that you don't trust. That's kind of the thing here, right? Jepperd kind of revealed his colors and played on the ignorance and the inexperience of Gus. That Gus had never really been out there in the world. Gus didn't know that you couldn't really trust people. The words of his father were accurate, right? That in this post-apocalyptic landscape, there were only two kinds of people, those who were self-serving and those who die. You don't want to be the ones who die, right? You cannot trust people. Stay in the woods. Do not leave. You have everything you need to learn how to survive here, to make it in this place. I taught you everything. And the first thing Gus did was betray the rules of his father. And the price he pays is he's being sold to basically a preserve, what is in effect a giant place of experimentation. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. I love it. And I will catch you all later. Peace.